Streaming now, this is the Wood TV Live Desk.
And good morning, everyone. Phil Pinarski here with the Wood TV Live Desk. Hope you're all having a great start to your Wednesday. It is Wednesday, so that means that we are now being joined by News 8 digital reporter Matt Jarowski, and he's here to discuss one of his latest pieces that you can actually find right now over on woodtv.com. It deals with a lot of pollutants going on across the Great Lakes region. And Matt, we learned a lot more about oil refineries and the fact that some of the wastewater that's being dumped goes directly into Lake Michigan. Matt, first off, thank you for joining us today. The story has a lot of moving parts, the number of refineries in the area, how much pollution is actually being put out there, the impacts that it's had on the environment, and what it could all lead to. So I guess just kind of, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about the story and why you specifically decided to kind of jump in and do a little bit more reporting on it.
Sure. So when I'm looking for stories that I believe deserve coverage, my goal is to find things that are relevant to the people of West Michigan. And I know if there's one thing that we care about here in West Michigan, it's the Great Lakes. They're a symbol for what we are as a state. Everyone vacations there, visits there in the summer, visits there all year round. And so the health of the lakes is something that I believe everybody kind of unanimously considers to be important. So as a local journalist, I'm looking to go further. A lot of people pay attention to local news, maybe surface level things. I'm looking to go deeper. So I'm looking at environmental sources, news studies, really hyper-specific outlets. And that includes some like energy outlets that focus specifically on energy, renewable energy, or pollutants, really focus on the EPA. And that's where I came across this study. It was really an analysis put together by the Environmental Integrity Project. It's a group that they consider themselves a watchdog group for the EPA, something that should be used to encourage the EPA to add more regulations to restrict or to tighten regulations. This information, they're looking at the wastewater that comes off of oil refineries all across the country. They compile data that's produced by those companies. This isn't even data that the EPA goes out and gets themselves. This is data that these companies are forced to report. And what we found is there are several oil refineries in the Midwest, which we knew, but some of the worst polluters are in the Midwest. And one specifically, BP's Whiting refinery, dumps straight into Lake Michigan. These are things we've known, but this new analysis really kind of shines a light on just how bad that pollution is and really what it means for the lakes.
And can you kind of touch on those impacts that we're talking about? I think it was a massive amount of nitrogen and other sort of chemicals are all being put directly into Lake Michigan. Can you kind of talk about some of the impacts that has? I know in your story there are a couple of photos that you used, one including a fish that seems to kind of have mutated. Some of those impacts I find very interesting as to what we can expect over really the time period due to this polluting.
Right. And it's important that we should highlight the fish. You can see it on the screen now. That was actually taken out of California. That was not out of Lake Michigan. Okay. But it shows you what selenium poisoning can do. Selenium, nickel, and nitrogen were the big three pollutants that this study or this analysis focused on. Selenium and nickel are both heavy metals, and they're necessary. We need them in our bodies, but we need them at very small levels. So even extra pollutants like the thousands of pounds of selenium that's being dumped into the lake every year, or nickel, that all builds up in the Lake Michigan ecosystem. One of the things that the EIP pointed out, and I talked to an expert with Grand Valley's Annis Water Resources Institute as well to kind of learn more about how these pollutants specifically impact the lake. For selenium, nickel, and nitrogen, they're all going to stay relatively close to that area, which would be the southern end of Lake Michigan. BP Whiting is right on the coastline in Indiana. They literally have 4 wastewater outputs. 2 go directly into the lake, 2 flow into a canal that flows into the lake. So all that pollution is ending up in Lake Michigan. Most of it is going to cycle and stay just in that nearby place. However, there's one pollutant that the EIP suspects is there, which would really impact the entire system, and that is PFAS.
Yeah, and kind of just leading into that, PFAS, wouldn't be a Michigan story regarding pollutants if it didn't involve some form of PFAS. You touched
Right.
on it a little bit at the end of the article. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about the PFAS element to this whole story in general?
Sure. So really, part of the reason why I didn't go too far into detail on PFAS in this specific story is because the EIP couldn't go into specific detail because most of these refineries aren't even testing for it. They don't have to. A few of them have gone, especially on the west side of the country, gone above and beyond and testing their wastewater for PFAS. And in the limited studies that have been done, a lot of PFAS is being found in this wastewater. So it stands to believe that it's likely coming from the BP Whiting plant as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I know when I talked to Dr. Radisky from the Annis Institute, we're talking about how the impacts of selenium and nitrogen and nickel can play on the lake. Those are measured in parts per million and billion. PFAS is so toxic, it's measured in parts per trillion. So even just minute, any amount of pollution can have a really big impact.
And switching gears here just a little bit, Matt, I do want to talk about these regulations that you included in your article that the EIP sort of cited.
Right.
They said that the EPA's regulations on the wastewater and the pollution that can be put in there and everything, that was all set back in 1985. The EIP called them a little bit outdated at this point, some almost 40 years later. Can you touch on just why they kind of decided that this was outdated? I mean, how big of a difference are we talking about as far as some of the regulations that are required by the EPA?
That's really kind of the crux of the EIP's argument, is they're pushing for the EPA to update their standards. And a lot of this, two of the specific ones that they talked about were set in 1982 and 1985.
Mm-hmm.
So the EIP's point is things change. Our technologies are much better now than they were in the 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
Our standards should reflect that, especially now that we know just how harmful these pollutants are. Part of their big push is the EPA being a giant government agency, things tend to move slow. They tend to focus on one standard at a time. And when it comes to especially issues like PFAS, they believe that PFAS can be handled across industries instead of just one at a time. And they believe that that would expedite some of that problem. To tighten those restrictions and help keep our waterways cleaner.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I guess just kind of wrapping up, Matt, this, as I mentioned earlier, a whole lot of moving parts to this story. You took a really deep dive, really taking a look at this new report. But I guess the question remains, what happens next? What happens for these oil refineries? Are they set to change? Have they made any movement? Are they being asked to by the EPA or the EIP, or maybe even some of the cities and jurisdictions that these refineries are in? What is sort of the next step in this story?
The next step is that we don't know what the next step is. We're all waiting to see what happens. I'm sure the EIP would hope to see action soon.
Mm-hmm.
I did reach out to the EPA and to BP for comment on this story and to discuss these pollutants and what they're trying to do, whether it's to eliminate that pollution, those kind of steps. But the truth is, it all relies on the EPA. They're the ones that would hold these companies to a standard.
Mm-hmm.
And without that enforcement, there's really not a lot that can be done.
Right. Well, we know if there is any new movement, you will have that totally covered for us here on News 8. So, Matt, again, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate these talks, kind of seeing a little bit more in-depth view on these stories that you do and you put out every Sunday. Again, this story is called A True Toxicant. Oil refinery dumps tons of pollutant wastewater in Lake Michigan. It's a story that you can find right now over on our website, woodtv.com. If you're watching us on Facebook, you can find a link to that story right now in the description box and comments section. Matt, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Anytime, thanks.
And I want to thank everybody else for tuning in to this latest edition of the Wood TV Live Desk. I'm Phil Pinarski, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.